Hi folks, and welcome to our video on Andre Bazin's essay, The Myth of Total Cinema from 1946. This essay can importantly be found in that famous volume, What is Cinema, Volume 1. And importantly, it can be found right after the most famous and canonized essay of Bazin's, The Ontology of the Photographic Image, which we've talked about before. And I want to just begin by explaining the myth of total cinema simply by contrasting it with the ontology of the photographic image. If you're not familiar with that essay, the basic argument is to articulate something that is fundamental to the essence of photography as a medium. In other words, if you have an apple and you have a photograph of the apple, Bazin wants to articulate in the closest and most poetic possible terms what is the relationship between that image of the apple and the original apple that was photographed. He will argue that what the photograph of the apple has of the original apple is something he wants to call the ontology or being or essence of that apple. That a photograph essentially takes a sliver of the being of the thing that is photographed and imports it into a picture. And the simplest way of understanding this is simply looking at a painting of an apple and understanding that a painting of an apple does not contain that sliver of the apple's essence, but a subjective rendition of how that apple appeared to the artist. Understanding this basic idea of the ontology of the photographic image helps us understand just how wildly different the myth of total cinema is as a piece of realist film theory. I can summarize that difference this way. If the ontology essay investigates, say, the medium-specific properties of photographic images that connect them to the material world, the myth of total cinema investigates the human desire to create an illusory depiction of the material world. And I want you to think about that core difference as located right in the title. The ontology essay poses a question about the essence of a medium, whereas the myth of total cinema investigates a shared cultural desire, a myth, a story, an idea. So reflecting that core difference, I might put the summaries this way. The ontology essay investigates the essence of the photographic images that connects them to the material world, while the latter essay investigates the idea or myth of creating an illusory depiction of the material world. And you can locate these two essays on a kind of spectrum, from an interest in the materiality of a thing to an interest in the idea of a thing. Throughout this essay, Bazin is going to be talking about this dichotomy between matter and idea, materialism and idealism. Bazin gives a sort of very clear thesis in the first paragraph. He says, the cinema is an idealistic phenomenon. The concept man had of it existed, so to speak, fully armed in their minds, as if some Platonic heaven. So let's stop there. We might ask, what do you mean a concept existed of cinema in some Platonic heaven? Bazin might say, basically what I mean is that the idea of cinema existed before cinema, in other words, projected moving images, even existed. So you might say, oh, kind of like the fact that the idea of human flight long preceded the invention of the airplane. And in fact, Bazin will use this very analogy at the end of his essay. In a rather provocative passage, he'll say, thus, the myth of Icarus had to wait on the internal combustion engine before descending from the Platonic heavens. But it had dwelt in the soul of every man since he first thought about birds. To some extent, one could say the same thing about the myth of cinema. So far we know that the goal of the essay is to argue that cinema existed as an idea, just like human flight existed as an idea before human beings invented the first airplanes. And we might respond by thinking, I understand the flight analogy, but I don't quite understand the cinema analogy. Why should I believe this argument that the idea of cinema existed before animated photographs were projected on a screen for collective consumption? The essay more or less spends most of its time answering this question by looking at history. And in fact, this essay is really a book review of a well-known and influential piece of film history that tried to track the history of the medium as it developed. So Bazin will cite a number of pieces of evidence. Here's one. He'll say, there are numberless writings, all of them more or less wildly enthusiastic, in which inventors conjure up nothing less than a total cinema that is to provide that complete illusion of life, which is still a long way away. So all he's really saying here is that if you examine a number of the key players who invented individual components of what we come to identify as cinema, right? The projector, the pieces of the projector, animated motion, the development of synchronized sound. If we examine all of those individuals and we look at their biographies and look at the things that they wrote and the things that they thought, we'll understand that a number of these individuals, including folks who were not even part of this history, had an obsession with the idea of an image that would reproduce the likeness of the material world. that in some way, even though they themselves were not wholly responsible for the invention of what we call cinema, but only responsible for a small piece of it, they nevertheless had the idea or the desire to create that full immersive image that is more lifelike than any image in the history of images. So this brings us to a question that Bazin has not yet really defined. What does he mean by total cinema? So we might ask, what is total cinema exactly? And here's Bazin's definition. Total cinema is a total and complete representation of reality, the reconstruction of a perfect illusion of the outside world in sound, color, and relief. A recreation of the world in its own image, an image unburdened by the freedom of interpretation of the artist or the irreversibility of time. So in other words, total cinema is the idea of a kind of image that completely imitates the material world in every conceivable perceptual aspect. It's an ongoing desire, a pursuit that conceivably never ends. So here you start to understand that by cinema, Bazin does not necessarily mean cinematic storytelling. He means a kind of image, and he mostly means the perceptual qualities of the kind of image that we identify as a cinematic image. A cinematic image as distinct from a painting, as distinct from a photograph. So I want to dwell on this notion that total cinema is itself not a thing in the world, it's an idea. In other words, it's a pursuit that conceivably never ends. And Bazin might say, this is why I famously write in this essay, in short, cinema has not yet been invented. This is one of the most famous lines from this essay, and you'll see it right here. He says, every new development added to the cinema must paradoxically take it nearer and nearer to its origins. In short, cinema has not yet been invented. Let's dwell on this small passage for a moment. So largely what he's saying here is if you look at the history of the medium that we call cinema, and you could start with the 1895 Lumiere films of the train arriving at the station, or you could in fact start earlier with animated films that were not projected on screens. You could even start earlier with still images that you might say capture something that is close to the essence of cinema. But you would also have to include things like the development of synchronized sound, the development of color. For him, you might say the development of 3D, which was something very interesting to him, as well as the development of various forms of aspect ratios in the 1950s. These are what he means by every new development added to the cinema. And what he says later, that each of these developments takes cinema nearer and nearer to its origins. What he means is that with each development, we're getting closer and closer to this abstract idea of total cinema, a complete representation of the world that's convincing and perceptually rich. And this is what he means by the fairly paradoxical statement, cinema has not yet been invented. Because if cinema is in fact an idea, we still have not achieved it. So let's just take a look at some of these new developments and think about it in the way that Bazin might think about it. For example, Bazin doesn't really talk about this in his essay, but a number of scholars have applied it to Bazin's ideas in this essay. 19th century panorama paintings. Paintings that were popular in the 19th century that were so large and vast and were circular in form that you felt as if you were immersed within an environment. Almost as if what you were looking at simulated an actual world. It was a kind of 19th century virtual reality. We might put this in the history of the myth of total cinema, long before we even had what we would call a moving image. Or take this, which in fact Bazin does invoke in his essay, Reynaud's Pantomime Lumineuse from 1892. Some will call it the first animated film. Bazin is interested in it because it does something, that is, it synthesizes image and movement in a way that hadn't quite yet been done in this way. It is part of the long history, Bazin says, of the myth of total cinema. Or take what is conventionally understood as the first film, the arrival of the train at La Ciotat by the Lumiere brothers, 1895. This itself can also be understood as merely a new development in the history of cinema that in fact had preceded. Or take this, The Jazz Singer, 1927, sometimes called the first full-length feature narrative film that uses synchronized sound. However, as film historians know, it was certainly not the first instance of synchronized sound. And this in fact is part of Bazin's point. As far back as 1894, Thomas Edison and a man named Dickson created an experiment that successfully synchronized image and sound. It used a different set of technological means that wouldn't have the same possibilities that were discovered in the 1920s. But the fact that we have a synchronized sound film from as early as 1894 reinforces Bazin's point that the idea of putting sound and image together to mimic the materiality of the world was there from the very beginning. And this is what Bazin says. He says, there was not a single inventor who did not try to combine sound and relief with animation of the image, whether it be Edison with his kinetoscope made to be attached to a phonograph, or de Manet and his talking portraits, or even Nadar, who shortly before produced the first photographic interview. Once again, the idea preceded the conventional adoption of a technology that we often identify as happening in 1927. The same thing might be said of color. If you ask many people with a cursory understanding of the history of cinema what the first color film is, they will often say The Wizard of Oz of 1939. And indeed, that's a pretty good answer, because 1939 is a landmark year in the dissemination of Technicolor in Hollywood feature film. But there were much earlier instances of color film before 1939. A film called A Visit to the Seaside from as early as 1908 uses a different color process. And in his essay, Bazin will not even talk about this film, but talk about color stenciling that emerged even earlier as still representing the desire to have a moving color image, because the world that we perceive with our own eyes is moving and in color. Bazin will write, if color had not yet appeared, it was because the first experiments with the three-color process were slower in coming. But E. Reynaud had been painting his little figurines for some time, and the first films of Méliès are colored by stenciling. Or take 3D or stereoscopic cinema, which Bazin does refer to in his essay under the name relief. We tend to think of the golden age of Hollywood stereoscopic cinema or 3D cinema to be in the 1950s, especially the years 1952 to 1954. And of course, it's had its renaissance in the 21st century. But importantly, this was not the first instance of 3D cinema, nor was it the first instance of stereoscopic imagery, which long precedes the invention of the moving image. Or consider CinemaScope, which emerged in the same years, 1953, which incorporates a set of technologies for expanding the aspect ratio of the image and giving a much wider view of space. Bazin might say that this was done not only to distinguish cinema as a medium from television, which is the more practical understanding, but also because having a more wider view of vision better simulates our perceptual access to the world, mimicking our own wide view of space. And you might say that IMAX, which was introduced decades later, does a similar thing. But instead of mimicking our wide view of space, it creates a more immersive environment by stretching things vertically. Finally, you might even say that something like VR could be understood as part of the myth of total cinema. Because what else is VR other than an image technology whose defining quality is to simulate the perception of reality, of material reality? Many scholars have suggested that when Bazin writes about the myth of total cinema in 1946, he's writing in such a way as if he understands a human desire to mimic material reality that will give way to all of these digital technologies that emerged many, many, many decades after his death. So what are the implications of this idea that there is this thing called the myth of total cinema, which human beings have and continuously pursue? Well, I'll talk about it in three main ways. Number one is that it's interesting and important within the history of film and film theory that Bazin here offers what you might call an idealist theory of cinema. He writes, any account of the cinema that was drawn merely from the technical inventions that made it possible would be a poor one indeed. On the contrary, an approximate and complicated visualization of an idea invariably precedes the industrial discovery, which alone can open the way to its practical use. In other words, Bazin is addressing a popular and legitimate understanding of how media develop. That is, that media and new technologies only develop once we have the material means to create them. Bazin is arguing against this. He's saying that this view of history and of the history of technology obscures the degree to which ideas precede technologies, and ideas precede the introduction of various material forms. And some deeper implications of this idea can be read in the very first sentence. Remember how I mentioned that this essay is not simply an essay, but a book review of a history of cinema by Georges Sadoul? Well, this is what Bazin says about that book. He says, the impression left on the reader by Sadoul's admirable book on the origins of the cinema is of a reversal, in spite of the author's Marxist views of the relations between an economic and technical evolution and the imagination of those carrying on the search. So what Bazin is saying here is really interesting. He's reading Georges Sadoul's massive history of the invention of cinema. Georges Sadoul writes this massive history of cinema, but it is clear to the reader that he is a Marxist thinker. And if you're a Marxist thinker, you're going to be sympathetic to a philosophical position known as materialism. In particular, if you're a Marxist, you're going to be sympathetic to a position known as dialectical materialism or historical materialism. But just for the sake of argument, we can simplify that position in this way. If you're a materialist, you might think that ideas arise only as products and reflections of material conditions. So if you're a Marxist historian, you might emphasize the ways that material conditions precede fluctuations in historical change. And if you're a Marxist historian who thinks about the invention of a medium, you might emphasize the fact that certain material conditions, that is, certain kind of technological or scientific discoveries, had to precede the invention of various aspects of the cinematic medium. But what Bazin is saying is that if you read closely, it's almost as if Sadoul himself, in relaying this history, is giving us the opposite view. That in all the information he's compiled, he's perhaps unwittingly giving the picture of the invention of cinema that suggests over and over that cinema existed as an ideal or a myth in the minds of the people who invented various aspects of it. And that this is why Bazin thinks that we should consider an idealist theory of the history of cinema. This is why Bazin invokes Plato when he says things like Platonic. Because for Plato, concepts or ideas exist independently of any particular instance of that concept. This is otherwise what is disclosed in Plato's theory of the forms. The notion that there is a true realm beyond the senses that houses concepts, the true form of the chair, the true form of beauty. And that all the individual instances of those concepts are merely reflections of those truer, perceptually inaccessible versions of them in the realm of the forms. Bazin is invoking Plato so that you understand the importance of this idea, that cinema itself might be understood as an idea that exists, poetically, in some realm of the forms. Number two is that it's a response to the valorization of silent cinema. There's one really important sentence in the essay that suggests this. Bazin says, "It is understandable from this point of view that it would be absurd to take the silent film as a state of primal perfection, which has gradually been forsaken by the realism of sound and color." This might be a bit confusing if you're not so familiar with the history of film theory. But a number of the most influential theorists of film, who were writing in the 19-teens, 20s, and even 30s, had the idea that the pinnacle of cinematic expression was captured in the silent era, and that the emergence of synchronized sound film, which started to happen in the late 1920s but became really entrenched in the 1930s, was actually a devolution of the cinematic art. And the arguments for this were varied, but the most popular version of this argument comes from a theorist named Rudolf Arnheim, who basically says that for art to be art, it needs to be distinguished from reality. And that cinema, although it highly resembles material reality because of the convincing nature of photographic likeness, nevertheless, he says, cinema should be celebrated for all the ways in which it is distinct from material reality. The fact that it is in black and white, not color. The fact that it is silent and without sound. The fact that it is a flat picture as opposed to an immersive three-dimensional space. Those are the things that change reality, and therefore, that is the locus of cinema as an art. Thus, for Arnheim, the development of synchronized sound film was the death knell for the cinematic art, because it took cinema as a medium that defamiliarized reality and simply made it to an imitative medium. Bazin did not agree with this. Bazin saw synchronized sound film as its destiny. And in this essay, he says that in fact synchronized film is merely one development in the history of cinema's destiny, a destiny that would never be fulfilled. Because for Bazin, there is no such thing as truly fulfilling the myth of total cinema. That's what makes it a myth. It's a desire. And if you take the myth of cinema as important, you would be dead wrong to consider silent film the state of primal perfection of the medium. What's the third implication of this idea? Well, in many ways, this idea has been adopted by new media theorists, or people who are interested in the intersection between film and new media. And by new media, I simply mean things like digital media and the internet. So you might think about this definition of total cinema, a total and complete representation of reality, the reconstruction of a perfect illusion of the outside world in sound, color, and relief, and think how this actually almost better reflects animation and CGI. What you're looking at right now is not a real lion or a photograph lion, but in fact, CG remake of The Lion King, in which you might say part of the ambition was to reconstruct a perfect illusion of the outside world in sound and color. And you might also say, and this is something I invoked earlier, that the myth of total cinema finds an even greater example in VR, because VR, as we know, has the ambition to erase the frame, to give us an image that in fact simply resembles our perceptual access to the world. And that could be called itself not the ending of the myth of total cinema, but yet another development. Another way to look at the implications of this is to think about the tensions between the ontology of the photographic image and CGI. Many people will look at contemporary CG-heavy cinema and say that it loses something of the Bazinian interest in what a photograph can do. What you're looking at here is a special effects reel from the film Roma, a film that, if you're familiar with the conventions of realism in film history, you'll understand that Roma wants to look like Italian neo-realist film, which was famously tied to photography. There was no CG realism in 1945. But you might look at this film, discovering just how many of its images were produced with CGI, and say, perhaps this is part of that myth of total cinema. Perhaps we can say that this film is still Bazinian, despite having so much post-production computer-generated work, if we turn to the essay called The Myth of Total Cinema and away from the essay called The Ontology of the Photographic Image. This is just one more way that we might cash out the implications of this essay by Bazin from 1946. Thanks.